Every day, Thomas prayed the Rosary. He had been told it was powerful, that it could bring peace, protection, and even miracles. And yet, nothing changed. His life was still filled with struggles. His prayers felt empty, and deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Have you ever felt this way? Have you ever prayed, hoping for a breakthrough, only to be met with silence? But what if I told you there are 3 hidden sins that could be blocking the power of your rosary right now? What if, without even realizing, your prayers were being silenced before they could even reach heaven? It's terrifying to think about, isn't it? And the 3rd sin, that one is the most shocking of all. Most people never realize they're committing it, and yet, it's one of the biggest reasons why so many prayers go unanswered. This isn't just a theory. Even great saints, like Padre Pio, warned us about these dangers. He knew that certain sins don't just weaken our prayers, they can completely block God's grace from reaching us. Thomas had no idea he was guilty of these sins. He thought he was doing everything right. He went to church. He said his prayers. He held on to his rosary like a lifeline. But the truth was, he was caught in a dangerous spiritual trap, and he didn't even see it. And the worst part? Many people today are in the exact same situation. They pray, they beg, they plead, but they don't realize that something is standing in the way. The good news? There is a way out. Once Thomas discovered what was blocking his prayers, everything changed. His rosary became a source of true strength. He finally felt God's presence in his life again. And today, you're going to discover the exact same truth that saved him. But before we begin, make sure you're fully prepared for what you're about to hear. Some of these sins are deeply uncomfortable to confront. Some may even shock you. But if you truly desire a deeper connection with God, you must know what they are. So stay with me until the very end, because what you learn today could transform your faith forever. Thomas gripped his rosary so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Bead by bead, he whispered the same prayers he had said 1,000 times before. His lips moved, but his heart felt numb. He had been told that the rosary was powerful, that it could change lives, protect from evil, and bring blessings beyond imagination. He had heard stories of people receiving miraculous healings, escaping danger, and experiencing deep spiritual peace, all because they prayed the rosary. But for Thomas, none of that seemed to be happening. Every morning, he would kneel beside his bed, eyes closed, whispering each prayer with mechanical precision. Hail Mary, full of grace. He repeated the words, but they felt empty. He wasn't even sure he was thinking about them anymore. He was just saying them, over and over, like a routine he had memorized but no longer felt. And that was the problem. No matter how much he prayed, nothing changed. His struggles remained. His financial problems loomed over him. His relationships were strained. His heart felt distant from God. He would beg for peace, for guidance, for a sign that God was listening. But silence was all he ever received. At first, he tried to brush off the feeling. Maybe I just need to pray harder, he told himself. Maybe. God was testing him, seeing how persistent he would be. So Thomas doubled his efforts. He woke up earlier to pray longer. He added more prayers to his routine. He fasted. He attended Mass more frequently. He did everything he could think of to prove his devotion. And yet, the emptiness remained. One night, sitting in the dim glow of his bedside lamp, he scrolled through his phone, reading stories of saints and devout Catholics who had experienced miracles through the rosary. A woman who had been healed of a terminal illness. A man who had been freed from years of addiction. A family that had been reunited after decades of division. Thomas wanted to believe these stories. He wanted to have faith. But deep down, an uncomfortable thought began to take root in his mind, one that he didn't dare speak aloud. Why is it working for them but not for me? He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. But it lingered. For months, Thomas carried this silent burden. He went through the motions, pretending that everything was fine, but inside, he felt like a man stranded in the middle of a desert. praying for rain, but only feeling the scorching heat of silence. Then came the night that changed everything. He had just finished another rosary, one that felt just as empty as the others. Frustrated, he placed the beads down on his nightstand and stared at the ceiling. The air felt heavy, the room unnervingly quiet. And then, the thought came again, this time louder, more pressing, more terrifying. What if my prayers aren't reaching heaven at all? His heart pounded. What if something is blocking them? A shiver ran down his spine. He had always believed that prayer was powerful, that nothing could stand in its way. But what if he was wrong? What if, without even realizing it, he had been sabotaging his own prayers? Suddenly, memories of Padre Pio's warnings came flooding back to him. He had read once that not all prayers are heard in the way we expect. Some are hindered. Some are even silenced by the very lives we lead. Thomas swallowed hard. He had been praying for answers, for a sign that God was listening. What if this fear gnawing at his soul, was the answer? He couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to know the truth. That night, he made a decision. He would search his soul. He would examine his actions, his thoughts, his habits, every part of his life. If something was blocking his prayers, he had to find out what it was. But what he was about to uncover would shake him to his core. For months, Thomas felt like he was running on autopilot. Each day, he rose with the sun, recited his prayers, and went about his routine as if it was just another part of his day. He wasn't really thinking about the words he said, nor was he aware of the weight they carried. His prayers had become mechanical, words without meaning. The rosary, once a source of comfort and spiritual strength, had turned into nothing more than a habit. At first, Thomas couldn't understand how this had happened. He had started out so eager to grow in his faith, so passionate about his connection to God. He had felt that spark deep within his heart, the desire to be close to the divine, to receive God's grace. But now, he was stuck in a cycle of empty ritual. The more he tried to keep up with his daily devotions, the more he felt disconnected. Every time he picked up his rosary, it was like he was simply going through the motions. Hail Mary, full of grace. Holy Mary, Mother of God. The words were the same as they had always been, but his heart was no longer there. He wasn't feeling the prayers. He wasn't experiencing the peace, the strength, the power that he once felt. It was as if he was just checking a box, as though reciting the prayers was a task that had to be completed, like a chore. The worst part? He didn't even realize what had happened at first. The spiritual numbness crept up on him slowly, so subtly that he didn't notice it until it had already taken root in his heart. Thomas began to feel more and more distant from God, and it terrified him. Why weren't his prayers working? Why? Couldn't he feel his presence anymore? He asked himself those questions repeatedly, but the answers never came. It wasn't just about the prayers. It was about his spiritual laziness. In his search for meaning, he recalled a conversation he had had with his priest several years ago. The priest had said something that stuck with him. The greatest enemy of a strong spiritual life is not sin, but spiritual laziness. It's easy to fall into a routine, to say the words, but to fail to mean them. When you do that, your prayers lose their power. At the time, Thomas had brushed it off. He thought it was just another sermon, another piece of advice that didn't really apply to him. But now, looking back, he realized just how right his priest had been. Thomas had become spiritually lazy. He wasn't putting in the effort anymore. The prayers were just words. The rosary had become just another part of his day, something to do out of habit, not a moment to connect with God. He wasn't bringing his heart to the prayer. He wasn't asking for divine help, seeking guidance, or pouring out his soul before God. This is where the danger lay, in the repetition without reflection. It was the same as reading a book without ever stopping to understand the meaning of the words. It was a dangerous trap. And the worst part was, Thomas didn't realize how deep in the trap he had fallen. But that's the thing with spiritual laziness. It creeps in slowly, almost imperceptibly. One day, you're praying fervently, feeling God's presence. And the next day, you're just saying the words with no real sense of meaning. You stop caring about the depth of your prayers, and suddenly, you feel disconnected. But it doesn't happen all at once. It happens little by little until one day, you wake up and realize that your connection to God is almost gone. Thomas began to notice the signs. He no longer felt the peace he once felt after praying. The words of the Rosary seemed like a foreign language. He couldn't focus. His thoughts wandered, and he couldn't bring them back to the prayer. And worst of all, his heart wasn't in it anymore. What happened to him? Was his faith gone? Had he lost it forever? He didn't know. But he knew that something had changed. Something had shifted deep within him. It wasn't just the Rosary. His entire spiritual life had started to feel like a routine, something he did because he was supposed to. Church attendance, confession, even acts of charity, it all felt distant, like he was doing it out of obligation rather than love. He couldn't remember the last time he had truly felt connected to God, and it was then that he realized the truth that he had been avoiding. Thomas was stuck in the trap of spiritual complacency. He was spiritually lazy, and it was keeping him from experiencing the fullness of God's grace. Let me ask you this. Do you ever feel like you're stuck in a spiritual routine? Maybe you say the prayers, attend Mass, do all the right things, but something just doesn't feel right. It's almost like you're missing that connection, that sense of divine presence. Could you be falling into the same trap? Take a moment to think about it. Are you just going through the motions? Do you feel like your prayers are becoming mechanical, with no real heart behind them? Are you really seeking God, or are you simply completing a task? Because if you are, the consequences can be dire. Spiritual laziness doesn't just affect your prayers, it affects your entire spiritual life. It can close your heart to God and leave you isolated. Over time, this distance grows, and soon, you may find yourself feeling like Thomas, wondering why your prayers seem unanswered, why your faith seems weak, and why God feels so far away. In the next part of his journey, Thomas would face a decision to either continue down the path of spiritual indifference or to seek out the deep renewal that he so desperately needed. But the cost of inaction was high. Time was running out, and the spiritual consequences of his laziness were becoming clearer with each passing day. Think about this. What if the key to reconnecting with God was as simple as asking yourself one question? Are you truly praying, or are you simply repeating words? Thomas had always considered himself a forgiving man. He spoke the words with ease, "I forgive you." But deep within him, there was a quiet, hidden rage, an anger he thought he had buried long ago. It was a resentment that began years ago, when a close friend had betrayed him. At the time, Thomas had been devastated. The betrayal was a deep wound, one that cut into his soul, leaving scars that never truly healed. He had said the words, he had gone through the motions of forgiveness, but something remained. Each time the memory resurfaced, each time he thought about what had been done to him, Thomas felt his heart harden just a little more. He tried to convince himself that he had forgiven. He told others he had let it go, but his thoughts betrayed him. They would drift back to that moment, to that friend who had caused him so much pain. And with each recollection, a storm of resentment would rise in his chest, but Thomas didn't see it. He didn't realize how deeply this unresolved anger had taken root in his heart. He kept saying the words, "I forgive you," but his heart didn't believe them. And that was where the problem began. The real issue wasn't in his words, but in his heart. The bitterness he carried had become a wall, one that was slowly blocking the very blessings God had been trying to pour into his life. As Thomas continued his daily prayers, the Rosary that had once felt like a lifeline now seemed distant. He didn't understand why. He had followed the rituals, said the prayers, yet something felt amiss. He had heard about the power of forgiveness before, how it opens the door to grace. But in the back of his mind, Thomas questioned whether forgiveness was truly necessary. After all, he had moved on from the incident, hadn't he? But deep down, Thomas knew he had never truly let go of the pain. The bitterness had been festering beneath the surface, and it had taken root in his soul. He couldn't fully move forward because the past was constantly pulling him back. It was like an anchor that kept him stuck, unable to rise above the hurt. The weight of this hidden resentment began to take a toll on his spiritual life. He tried to pray, but his heart was heavy. The words of the Rosary felt empty, like they were bouncing off the walls of his soul, unable to reach God. God wasn't distant. Thomas was the one who had built the wall. But how could this happen? Thomas was a believer. He had faith. He had followed all the right steps, said all the right prayers. Why wasn't God answering him? One day, during a particularly troubling prayer session, Thomas recalled a conversation he had with his priest years ago. His priest had warned him, "Holding on to anger is like poisoning your soul. It blocks your ability to receive God's grace." At the time, Thomas had brushed it off, thinking it was just another well-meaning sermon. But now he saw the truth. His anger wasn't just hurting his relationship with his friend, it was hurting his relationship with God. The priest had been right. Anger, especially when left unresolved, has a spiritual cost. It creates a barrier between you and God, and no matter how hard you pray or how much you ask for blessings, that barrier will remain until you address the root of the issue. Thomas began to realize the depths of his sin. He had never truly forgiven his friend. Forgiveness isn't just a word you say, it's a choice you make. It's a decision to release the grip that bitterness has on your heart and trust that God can heal the wounds that others have inflicted upon you. But Thomas hadn't made that choice. He had only said the words, but his heart was still holding on to the pain. Now, the consequences were clear. The blessings he longed for, the peace, the healing, the answers to his prayers were being blocked by his inability to forgive. The more he clung to the bitterness, the more distant God seemed. His prayers felt hollow. He was stuck in a spiritual drought. How could Thomas fix this? How could he break free from the chains of resentment that had bound his heart for so long? That night, as Thomas knelt beside his bed, he couldn't shake the weight of the realization. He had been praying for deliverance, for answers, for peace, but he hadn't truly addressed the heart of the matter. Forgiveness was the key, but it wasn't just a simple thing. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be done half-heartedly. It required deep humility, a willingness to release the hold that the past had on him. It meant trusting God with the pain and the injustice and allowing God to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. Thomas understood now that forgiveness was not for the one who had wronged him. It was for him. It was for his own spiritual healing, his own freedom. Until he could forgive, the bitterness would continue to poison his soul, and his relationship with God would remain strained. But how could he forgive? How could he release the hurt that had been done to him? It seemed impossible. That's when he heard a whisper in his heart, a reminder of the words he had heard so many times. "Forgive, as you have been forgiven." God had forgiven him of his sins. God had shown him mercy, grace, and love, even when Thomas didn't deserve it. If God could forgive him, surely he could forgive others. And in that moment, Thomas made a choice. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was a necessary one. He chose to forgive. And as he spoke the words from the depths of his heart, something inside him shifted. It was as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. The bitterness, the anger, the resentment, it all started to fade away. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a peace he hadn't known in so long. But he knew this was just the beginning. Forgiveness wasn't a one-time act. It was a process. Every day, he would need to choose forgiveness. Every day, he would need to let go of the past and trust God with the healing of his heart. But for the first time, Thomas felt hope. He knew that the walls between him and God were coming down. The rosary that had once felt empty now began to feel full again. The words, once hollow, now carried meaning. Thomas could feel the power of the prayers, the grace of God flowing through him as he spoke. His heart was lighter, freer, and his relationship with God had been restored. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but it was worth it. It opened the door to God's blessings and allowed Thomas to experience the peace he had longed for. But it wasn't just a magical solution. It was a journey that had only just begun. Thomas knelt by his bedside once again, beads of the rosary slipping through his fingers as he recited the prayers he had known all his life. Yet, as he muttered each word, something felt increasingly distant. There was a cloud hanging over him, a quiet shadow that gnawed at his heart. His prayers were like whispers in the wind, and despite his devotion, his soul felt empty. Was God really listening? Did this prayer have any real power? The question lingered in his mind. Did the rosary even work? And worse, was God truly hearing him? Thomas had been praying for months, for years, seeking answers, seeking peace, yet his life remained in turmoil. His struggles were constant, his heart was heavy, and his soul felt lost in a sea of unanswered prayers. What was the point of praying if nothing ever changed? The doubt began as a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing day. Doubt had crept into his heart unnoticed. He didn't recognize it at first. After all, he still recited the prayers, still followed the routines. But beneath the surface, a subtle disbelief was festering, tearing at his faith, weakening his connection to God. Every time he whispered the words of the rosary, his mind would wander, questioning if God was truly present in his life. Was God real? Was prayer real? It was a dangerous question to ask, and even more dangerous to leave unanswered. Because this silent doubt, this hidden unbelief, was like a poison slowly seeping into his soul, clouding his vision and stifling the grace that God so desperately wanted to pour into his life. As Thomas continued to pray each day, his actions seemed unchanged. But spiritually, he was being torn apart. Doubt had become his silent companion, one that no one could see, not even his closest friends or family. They saw a man who prayed fervently, a man who still went through the motions of faith, but deep inside, Thomas had started to question it all. Why wasn't God answering him? It wasn't as if Thomas hadn't tried. He had. He had been diligent, disciplined, and persistent. Yet the results were always the same: no change, no breakthrough. He could hear the priest's voice in his mind, urging him to trust, urging him to believe. But those words felt hollow now, mere echoes that faded into the silence of his doubt. What if God wasn't really there? As he sat in silence, the thoughts began to overwhelm him. What if this was all just a fantasy? What if prayer was just a way to pacify the soul, a ritual with no power behind it? And if it was just a fantasy, then what was he doing? Why keep praying when his heart was filled with so much doubt? The very foundation of his faith was crumbling, and Thomas didn't know how to stop it. The consequences of this doubt, however, were not immediately apparent. On the outside, Thomas appeared to be just as devout as ever. He continued to attend. Mass continued to pray, continued to wear his faith like a cloak. But inside, he was falling apart. He wasn't just questioning his prayers. He was questioning the very existence of God. The rosary, once his sacred source of peace, now felt like a meaningless ritual. Days turned into weeks, and the doubts only grew stronger. He would kneel by his bed, beads in hand, and recite the prayers, but each word felt like it was bouncing off the walls, never reaching heaven. The silence between him and God grew louder, and with it, the emptiness deepened. But what was even more terrifying was that he couldn't see the damage it was doing to his soul. He had been so consumed by his doubt that he hadn't noticed the toll it was taking. Slowly, without realizing it, he was drifting further away from the light of God. The more he doubted, the harder it became to believe. And the harder it became to believe, the more distant God seemed. It was a vicious cycle, one that Thomas was trapped in. Thomas began to feel isolated. He withdrew from others, not wanting to voice the doubts he was carrying. He felt ashamed of his thoughts, ashamed of the disbelief that had taken root within him. He had always been taught that faith was the answer, that if he just prayed hard enough, believed strongly enough, God would answer. But what if that wasn't true? What if God didn't hear him? What if there was no answer to his prayers? The worst part of it all was that Thomas didn't know how to break free. How could he fight a battle he couldn't see? How could he overcome a doubt that seemed so deeply embedded in his heart? He wanted to believe again, he truly did, but every time he tried, the questions and uncertainties would flood his mind, and that was when the darkness truly began to set in. Without realizing it, Thomas was falling into a spiritual abyss. Doubt had become his prison. It had closed the door to grace, and now, the blessings he had once hoped for seemed farther away than ever. The prayers, once filled with meaning, were now just empty words. The Rosary, once a source of power, now felt like a lifeless string of beads. He knew he had to confront his doubt. He had to face the question that terrified him most. Was God real? Was prayer truly powerful? But confronting that question meant confronting his fear, and fear was something Thomas had long tried to avoid. What if the answers he found only deepened his doubt? What if there was no answer at all? The consequences of doubt weren't immediate. Thomas didn't see them at first, but over time, as his heart grew colder, as his prayers became more meaningless, the consequences were impossible to ignore. He was losing his connection with God, and with it, he was losing his very soul. But deep inside, a voice whispered to him, "If you seek, you will find. If you ask, you will receive." This voice was faint, but it was there. It reminded him that, even in the midst of his doubt, God was still calling him back. Even in the darkest moments, there was hope. Thomas didn't know if he was ready to trust again, but he knew that if he didn't take the leap, he might lose everything. The fear of losing his connection with God became too great to ignore. And in that fear, Thomas finally made a choice. He would confront his doubt, not with more questions, but with a renewed commitment to believe, even if it was just a small step forward. Because Thomas knew that even the tiniest spark of faith was enough to reignite the power of God's grace in his life. Thomas stood at the foot of his bed, feeling a deep ache in his chest, a weight that had been growing for weeks, months even. He had been praying every day, reciting the Rosary with his hands trembling slightly as the beads passed between his fingers. Yet, despite his devotion, despite his efforts, his life remained the same. Every prayer felt empty. Every word seemed to fade into nothingness. The promise of God's grace, the blessings he had once hoped for, seemed so far out of reach. In his heart, there was a growing frustration, a quiet but persistent question. Why wasn't God answering? He had prayed for strength, for healing, for peace, but nothing changed. Nothing was happening. The doubts, the fears, they started creeping in, poisoning his faith, leading him to wonder if his prayers were in vain. One night, consumed by this restless feeling, Thomas sat in front of his computer. He searched for something, anything that could help him understand what was happening to him. He read articles, watched videos, and then, almost as if by fate, he stumbled upon a passage that stopped him in his tracks. It was a quote from Padre Pio. "A prayer without faith is like a letter without an address." The words struck him like a bolt of lightning. A letter without an address. The image was so vivid in his mind. A letter that was written with good intentions, carefully crafted with love and care, but left undelivered, floating aimlessly in the wind. Was that how his prayers had been all this time? Were his words reaching God, or were they just lost in the void? For a moment, everything stood still. Thomas stared at the screen, unable to look away, as the weight of Padre Pio's words sank in. He had been praying, yes, but without the one essential element, faith. His prayers had become mechanical, routine, a ritual that he followed every day without truly believing that they had power. He had recited the words, but had he truly meant them? Had he truly believed that God would hear him, would answer him, would change his life? It was a terrifying realization. He had spent so much time focusing on the act of praying, on the repetition, of the words, that he had forgotten the most crucial part of prayer: faith. Without faith, it was all just noise. Without faith, his prayers were nothing more than a letter sent to nowhere, with no address, no destination. What had he been doing? All this time, his faith had been in crisis for longer than he realized. He had thought that the more he prayed, the more God would hear him. But what if it wasn't about the number of prayers or the time spent reciting them? What if it was about something deeper? About the belief behind the words, the trust in God's power, the surrender of control? Thomas felt his heart race as the truth began to sink in. He had been blocking his own blessings. It wasn't that God wasn't answering his prayers, it was that he hadn't truly believed God would answer them. He had doubted, even if it was, subconsciously, and that doubt had acted as a barrier, keeping him from receiving the grace he so desperately needed. But how could he undo this? How could he move from a place of doubt to one of genuine faith? He felt overwhelmed by the thought of changing his entire mindset, of renewing his heart. But he knew that if he didn't, his prayers would remain unanswered. His soul would remain in turmoil. Have you ever felt like this? Have you ever prayed and felt like your prayers were going nowhere? Like you were speaking into the void, hoping for a sign, but nothing came. It's a feeling that many of us have experienced. But here's the question. Could it be that we, too, have been praying without truly believing? Could we have been like Thomas, saying the words but not addressing them to the right place, with the right intent? Thomas realized he had to take a step back. He needed to find that faith again, to believe in the power of prayer, to trust that God was not distant but very much present, waiting to pour his grace into his life. But how could he find that faith? How could he rebuild it after so many doubts had shaken its foundation? That night, Thomas knelt by his bed once again. But this time, something was different. This time, he wasn't just reciting the prayers as a routine. He wasn't just going through the motions. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to still his mind. For the first time in a long time, he let go of his doubts. He opened his heart and let himself believe, truly believe, that God was listening, that God was present in this moment, that God cared about his prayers. It wasn't easy. The doubt was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, whispering that nothing would change, that it was all in vain. But this time, Thomas didn't listen. He pressed on, clinging to the truth that faith was the key, not just in the act of praying, but in believing that his prayers had power, that God was active and present in his life. This was a turning point. Thomas knew he had to keep praying, but now he understood that prayer wasn't just about asking for things. It was about surrendering, about trusting that God had a plan, even if he couldn't see it yet. It was about having faith that God would answer in his time, in his way, even if it wasn't immediately obvious. As Thomas continued to pray, he began to feel something shift inside of him. The heaviness that had weighed on his soul began to lift, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't an immediate fix. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt, but Thomas knew that the most important thing was to keep trusting, to keep believing, and to keep praying with faith. In that quiet moment, as the night stretched on, Thomas understood that faith wasn't about avoiding doubt. It was about choosing to trust, even when doubt seemed overwhelming. And with that decision, he knew his prayers would no longer be lost. They had an address now, straight to the heart of God. This realization marked the beginning of a new chapter in Thomas's life, one where his prayers were no longer mere words, but a powerful connection to the divine. Now, as you read this, have you ever experienced something similar? Have you ever felt that your prayers weren't reaching God, only to realize that perhaps it was your faith that needed renewal? Share your thoughts. Let's talk about how we can all strengthen our faith and pray with purpose. Thomas had hit rock bottom. For so long, his prayers had felt like hollow echoes drifting into the void. Every night, he knelt beside his bed, beads in hand, reciting the Rosary out of habit. He had believed that if he said the words, if he followed the routine, somehow it would work. But the answers never came. The blessings felt distant, like mirages just out of reach, taunting him. He had prayed for healing, for peace, for strength, but it seemed like nothing ever changed. What had gone wrong? It wasn't until that fateful night, after stumbling upon Padre Pio's words, that the veil was lifted. The quote, "A prayer without faith is like a letter without an address," struck him like lightning. It wasn't just about the repetition of words, it was about faith. True faith. The kind of faith that isn't shaken by doubt. The kind that doesn't demand instant answers, but trusts in God's timing. The realization hit hard. He had been praying, but his prayers had been empty. He had been performing a ritual without truly believing, without truly expecting God to hear him. The pain of this realization was sharp, almost unbearable. How many times had he prayed and felt like it was all in vain? How many times had he questioned whether God was really listening? It was as if the answers had always been just out of reach, slipping through his fingers every time he thought he was close. He had to change. But how? It wasn't going to be easy, he knew that. Changing years of doubt, of mechanical prayers, would take time and effort. But Thomas was determined. He had to break free from the chains that had kept him bound. For so long, he wasn't going to let his prayers be empty anymore. He was going to pray with faith, with sincerity, and with a heart full of trust in God's love and power. The first step in his transformation was to confront the deep-seated resentment that had been weighing on him. For years, he had held on to anger and bitterness toward a friend who had wronged him. He had convinced himself that he had forgiven, that it was behind him. But every time he thought of the past, the resentment would rise to the surface, blocking the flow of peace and grace in his heart. Padre Pio's words echoed in his mind. You must forgive, not just with your lips, but with your heart. Thomas realized that he couldn't move forward until he truly let go of the bitterness that had taken root inside of him. So, he began to pray for the strength to forgive, not just for the sake of his own peace, but to allow God to heal the wounds in his heart. It wasn't easy, and the pain of forgiveness was real. But with every prayer, every moment of surrender, he felt the weight lifting from his soul. As the days passed, Thomas began to feel a change. His prayers started to feel different. There was a new intensity, a new depth to his words. He wasn't just reciting the Rosary anymore. He was speaking to God with his whole being. His heart had opened, and with it, his faith had been restored. No longer did he wonder if God was listening. Now he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that God heard every word, every plea, every whisper of his heart. But there was still one thing left: his doubts. For so long, he had questioned whether God was really working in his life, whether his prayers had any impact at all. He had spent so much time doubting, wondering if his efforts were futile, that it had nearly destroyed his faith. Now he had to confront that doubt head-on. Thomas realized that faith was not the absence of doubt, but the courage to trust even when doubts remained. It was about choosing to believe, even when the answers weren't immediate or obvious. And so, with every prayer, every repetition of the Rosary, he chose faith. He chose to believe that God was working in his life, even when he couldn't see the results right away. He surrendered his doubts to God, knowing that faith wasn't about having all the answers. It was about trusting that God had a plan, and that he would reveal it in his time. And then, something miraculous happened. Thomas began to feel the power of the Rosary like never before. For the first time, his prayers felt alive. He wasn't just going through the motions, he was experiencing a real connection with God. The answers didn't come all at once, but they started to trickle in. His prayers were answered not in the way he had expected, but in the way God had intended. He found peace in places he hadn't thought to look, strength in moments of weakness, and hope where he had once seen only despair. The blessings started to pour in, gradually but undeniably. It wasn't about immediate relief from every problem, but about the deep, abiding sense of trust that began to take root in his heart. He felt a new sense of purpose, a new clarity in his life. The struggles didn't disappear, but now he faced them with a renewed sense of faith. He no longer felt like he was fighting alone. God was with him, every step of the way. For the first time, Thomas understood the power of the Rosary, not as a mere ritual, but as a channel of grace. Each bead was a reminder of God's love, each prayer a step closer to His presence. And as Thomas continued to pray, he felt the presence of God more deeply than ever before. He knew that his prayers were not empty, that they were not in vain. The Rosary, once a routine, had become a powerful, living connection to God. His faith was no longer just a concept. It had become a part of his being, woven into every prayer, every moment of his life. Thomas had transformed. And as he looked back on his journey, he realized that the most important thing wasn't just about praying harder or longer. It was about praying with a heart full of faith, forgiveness, and trust in God's plan. In this moment, Thomas understood the true power of the Rosary. It wasn't just about the words he spoke. It was about the faith behind those words, the sincerity in his heart, and the trust he had in the God who heard every prayer, no matter how small. Thomas had found his way back to God. He had found the grace that had always been there, waiting for him to embrace it. And as he continued to pray, he knew that the blessings would continue to flow, not because he deserved them, but because God's love and grace were infinite, and they were always there for those who believed. As we come to the end of this powerful journey together, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've uncovered. Thomas's story isn't just his own. It mirrors the struggles many of us face in our spiritual lives. For so long, he prayed, but the answers seemed distant. He recited the Rosary without truly understanding its power. He was trapped in a cycle of spiritual emptiness, where his faith felt as though it was slowly slipping away. But just like Thomas, you might be feeling that same sense of spiritual stagnation. You may be praying, hoping, and waiting for answers, but instead you feel like your prayers aren't reaching God. Or perhaps you've become like Thomas once was, going through the motions, without truly feeling connected to the divine. It's easy to get stuck in that place where you feel as though your faith is a shadow of what it should be. But as we've seen in Thomas's life, there's hope. There's always a way back. Even when it feels like you've been lost in the darkness, there is light waiting for you. Thomas's transformation came when he realized that prayer isn't just about reciting words. It's about true faith, forgiveness, and trusting in God's timing. He understood that his prayers needed to be real, coming from a heart that truly believed and trusted in the power of God. And that's the key. Transformation is possible for anyone, no matter how far off the path they may feel. You can rebuild your relationship with God, deepen your prayer life, and feel the true power of your faith once again. It doesn't matter how many mistakes you've made, how many doubts you've had, or how many times you've felt lost. Just like Thomas, you can experience that same spiritual restoration and the fullness of God's grace. We all face moments when our faith feels weak or our prayers seem unheard, but it's in those very moments of struggle that God is shaping us, preparing us for a deeper connection with Him. Thomas's story serves as a reminder that even when it feels like God is silent, He's still working in your life. It's about perseverance, about learning to trust even when you can't see the outcome right away. Now, I want to ask you, how is your relationship with God? How is your prayer life? Are you truly opening your heart to Him, or are you simply going through the motions? If you feel like Thomas once did, it's time for a change. It's time to bring your prayers to life with real faith, to forgive as you've been forgiven, and to trust that God's plan for you is greater than anything you could imagine. But here's the thing. This journey doesn't end with one video. In fact, the transformation you've seen in Thomas's life can happen in your own life too. But it requires commitment, action, and surrender. If you're ready for a deeper relationship with God, if you're ready to see real transformation in your prayer life, then I have something special for you. We've created a playlist of videos that dive deep into topics just like this one, stories of transformation, spiritual growth, and how you can strengthen your relationship with God. If you're ready to take the next step, I encourage you to click on the playlist and explore these powerful teachings. You'll find real, actionable advice that will help you move forward in your spiritual journey, just like Thomas did. Trust me when I say this. You won't regret it. These videos are packed with insights that can change your life, just like the words of Padre Pio changed Thomas's life. And before you go, I want to hear from you. What did you think of Thomas's journey? Can you relate to his struggles with prayer, forgiveness, or doubt? Have you ever felt like your prayers weren't being heard, or that you were stuck in a cycle of spiritual emptiness? I'd love to. Hear your thoughts, your struggles, and how you've been able to overcome them in the comments below. It's time to take action. Let this be the moment you decide to fully embrace the power of prayer, to forgive those who have hurt you, and to trust in God's perfect plan. It's time to feel the power of the Rosary in your life and experience the transformation that only faith can bring. So, don't wait. Click the playlist now and begin the next chapter of your spiritual journey. The answers you're searching for are just one step away. The transformation is waiting for you.